Welcome everyone to the Phoenix Report. I am Jack Connor, and this video is the first in a series of what I'd like to call a fireside pitch. Now, granted, I'm not next to a fire right now, but just go with me on it. Uh, it- this is the type of video in which I will share with all of you some creative storytelling ideas I've had for a while in my head about a particular series or franchise. What I mean by that is I've done many movie reviews on this channel, but I figured I'd challenge myself a little to come up with a story idea of my own. I would ask myself, if I was in charge of rebooting or remaking a popular movie or TV series or adapting something, what would I do? Because after all, it's easy to be an armchair quarterback and critique a movie or a show that already exists. But what kind of story would I tell if I was a screenwriter or someone in charge of making creative decisions? Well, we're about to find out because I've had some of these ideas in my head for a while, but I've never actually sat down and typed them out. But I've always asked myself, what would I do if I was in charge or if I was going to make a movie, like a new movie version of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? That's a franchise that's been very dear to my heart for pretty much my entire life. The original 1987 Ninja Turtles animated series was one of my favorite shows as a little kid, and definitely some of my favorite toys as well. Those characters inspired me to take up martial arts when I was 6, and they absolutely captured my imagination at an early age. I loved all the movies, all the different shows, and even their 1990 coming out of their shells concert tour. I'd like to think that helped play a small part in shaping some of my musical tastes a little bit later in life. There have been multiple iterations of these characters over the years throughout comic books, TV series, and movies. And in a way, I still feel like the best Ninja Turtle stories, with all due respect to everything that's come before, I still think they're the best stories still have yet to be told with these characters. And I would want to do my very best to keep the franchise, or I should say, if I was in charge of making like a new Ninja Turtles movie, I would want to do my very best to keep the franchise grounded in reality as much as possible, while still remaining true to the essence of who these characters are. Sort of like the approach that Christopher Nolan took, when he was doing the Dark Knight trilogy. How he would take a character like Batman and try to make it seem as realistic and plausible as possible. Like use actual sets. Definitely try to ground it in reality as much as possible, which is not an easy task, especially when you're dealing with characters like the Ninja Turtles. I mean, there's a there's a leap of faith you have to take in your head, a suspension of disbelief, in order to accept the premise. But I still think like it could be done. Now, let's see. In order to properly establish the world of the Ninja Turtles, I think you would have to flesh out the backstory of a character who I would argue is the most important character in the franchise besides the four turtles themselves. And I'm talking about Master Splinter. I say that because without being raised by Splinter, the turtles do not become who they are. And Splinter has had two main origins in most of the various iterations over the years, the various Ninja Turtles media. Like in the original comics and in the original movies, Splinter was the pet rat of Master Hamato Yoshi, and he was mutated shortly after Yoshi and his wife were murdered. Now, in the 1987 and 2012 animated series, Yoshi and Splinter are the same person. They're the same character. And I gotta say, personally, I prefer the latter approach, where Yoshi and Splinter are one and the same. Hamato Yoshi and his history with Oroku Saki, who's the Shredder, that has constantly been, that is something that has consistently been depicted as a conflict that is deeply personal, and it greatly impacts everyone in the story. And to me, it makes a lot more sense for Yoshi to become a mutant rat rather than for a rat to instantly become more human and somehow gain the knowledge of an experienced ninja master. You know, I felt like it just makes more sense for Yoshi to become a rat and use his knowledge to help raise the turtles. That's just me. Traditionally, Yoshi and Saki had a great deal of history in Japan before coming to the United States. They're most often depicted as being rivals, although it's possible that they could have been friends at one point in their lives. Now, keep in mind, I am not an expert on Japanese history and culture, but Hamato Yoshi, to me, has always seemed to represent a more of a traditional, honorable samurai warrior, or at least a warrior in the samurai tradition, rather than a ninja assassin, someone who hides in the shadows and assassinates people. That's not really that it never really seemed like that's what Yoshi and Splinter were all about. But if this story is taking place in modern day Japan, I could see how the clash between keeping traditions alive and also evolving with the times could definitely be a central theme of the story, or at least that part of the story. So if I were to develop their history, maybe I would have Yoshi and Saki. Um, maybe they both come from the same rural town or village in Japan. Maybe they're from the country, but but maybe they themselves were fairly sophisticated and well-educated men. Both of them, probably went to college. Maybe they both served in the military at some point. I think, I guess, I'm not sure what's involved with becoming like Japanese special forces, for example. But like I could see those two guys being highly trained and decorated, soldiers, and maybe they would learn a lot of different techniques in addition to the traditional samurai and ninjutsu that they're both known for. Maybe serving in the military might help Yoshi and Saki earn their nicknames of Splinter and Shredder, respectively. Who knows? But maybe at some point they both return home. Maybe to properly join the Foot Clan or the Hamato Clan. Whatever. It would probably be the Foot Clan. Who would maybe be legit at first, but it would be a clan that their families have been affiliated for generations, for hundreds of years. Now, at some point, Yoshi and Saki would have to meet Tang Shen, who Yoshi ends up falling in love with and marrying. Typically, Saki has been depicted as being jealous of Yoshi, maybe because he's also in love with Tang Shen. I mean, you don't necessarily just need to throw in the love triangle aspect of it, but I know that's sort of a part of the story in most of the depictions. So you could have that dynamic there, but I would imagine that the conflict between these two guys would have to run a little bit deeper than both being in love with the same woman. I mean, granted that could definitely split apart any friendship, but it feels like it's much more personal and deeper than that. They would have to have some sort of difference in philosophy, kind of like Professor X and Magneto in the X-Men. Now, at some point, Saki would have to take control of the Foot Clan, reorganizing it into something that more resembles the Yakuza, or the Japanese mafia, basically. And this transition would have to be so drastic that Yoshi and Shen would be forced to leave Japan and flee to New York City. There are a couple different stories, I think, in which Yoshi was, I think, framed for the murder of their master or something like that. You could go that route. I don't know. It could be something like that, something that Saki does to discredit Yoshi in his country, so much so that he leaves and goes for the States. So, and New York City obviously is where they have to end up. I always found it interesting that Yoshi's wife, Tang Shen, has, it sounds like a Chinese name. Now, I find that interesting because, historically, the Japanese and Chinese have not always gotten along. Now, if Yoshi and Shen were to flee to New York City, it would make sense for them to end up either in Chinatown or some sort of Japanese neighborhood in Manhattan or Queens. I'm not a New Yorker, so if anyone listening is a New Yorker and knows of a Japanese area of New York, then let me know. But it seems like they would most likely end up with maybe Tang Shen has some relatives who are in New York. Maybe some cousins or some aunts and uncles or something like. You know, it makes sense that they would have some sort of support system out there. Um, I know at some point, and which is something that the 2012 animated series really did that I liked. At some point, Tang Shen gives birth to their daughter, Miwa, and it also, and like I said before, it makes sense that Yoshi and Shen would, while they're in New York, they would establish a relationship with some of their relatives and neighbors. Usually, this ends up being the case in many immigrant neighborhoods in big cities like New York or San Francisco, or you know, especially in Asian communities, they often tend to be very tight knit, from what I understand. Um, let's see. Unfortunately, though, as in most Ninja Turtles lore, eventually Saki and the Foot Clan would end up tracking down Yoshi and attempt to assassinate him. Now, there are several ways you can go about doing this. I think typically it ends in like a house fire or something like that, or, some of the foot ninjas might try to put out a hit on Yoshi. There are several ways you could do that. But somehow Yoshi would have to survive this attempt on his life. But unfortunately, Tang Shen would be killed, either on purpose or inadvertently. Um, and Yoshi would have to believe that their baby daughter Miwa had also died, either in a fire or in some sort of horrible circumstance. Now, similar to what the 2012 animated series did, where they revealed that um, Miwa had survived. What Yoshi did not know is that Oroku Saki had rescued the baby and eventually raised her as his own, renaming her Karai. Now, Karai is a character in the Ninja Turtles that has had several different incarnations. I like the idea of her being the biological daughter of Hamato Yoshi and Tang Shen, but being raised by the Shredder. You get that duality there. It reminds me a lot of of that movie from 1998, The Mask of Zorro, with Antonio Banderas. Kind of a similar plot line there. It's definitely it's a formula, but I think it could work. The tricky part here, I think, is connecting all this backstory to the mutation that transforms Yoshi into Splinter and to the Turtles into what they end up becoming. Now, in most Ninja Turtles media, the mutagen, or the ooze, is made by a company called TCRI or TGRI. I think in some different iterations of it, but I mainly know it as TCRI. But in most cases, some of the mutagen falls off of a truck in a freak accident and transforms the turtles and Splinter into what they end up becoming. I know that's a reference to Marvel's Daredevil comics and how Daredevil was started. And, Splinter is even sort of a parody of Stick, who's Daredevil's teacher in the Marvel comics. Um, I don't know if you necessarily have to go that route for it. I mean, I almost feel like that's too much of a coincidence that this happens. Maybe maybe you could have like you alter the backstory a little bit to where when Yoshi and Shen first moved to America, maybe Yoshi gets like a low-level job as, maybe as a janitor in TCRI just because he has to make ends meet. He can't find work. Maybe the turtles could have been pets of either Yoshi's or Tang Shen's. It's possible that both Yoshi and Shen could also be huge fans of art and the Renaissance artists, which of course would inspire them to name the turtles what they name them. Now, you could definitely play around with some of the character dynamics there, and that could be like something that Yoshi and Shen have in common, and that's you know that could be an interesting way to go about it, I think. Usually, the mutagen, the ooze, works from what I understand. Usually, how it works with the mutation is that this is according to the rules of the Ninja Turtles. So, where like the person who is exposed, or the person or creature who is exposed to the ooze they usually take on the characteristics of the animal that he or she has last come into physical contact with. For example, Yoshi would turn into a rat because right before he got hit with the ooze, he might have come into physical contact with a rat. Now, in New York City, it's not really hard to think of a scenario where he might come into contact with, a rat from the sewer or from an alley or something like that. But you would also have to have the turtles to have the turtles would have had to come into contact with probably either Yoshi or another human being in order to become more human. So either way, once Yoshi becomes a rat, he knows that his life will never be the same, and he has to stay hidden, to protect himself and the turtles. That sets up, how they grow up the way they do. Now, as far as where Splinter and the turtles live, that provides its own unique set of challenges. Now, of course, typically we all know that they're depicted as living in the sewers, but they would also have to have some sort of inhabitable space to, in order to live down there and to survive for years. You always see them have things like shelter, electricity, running water, food. All that stuff would be necessary for them to survive. Now, that's one of the things that really, draws me to this is that the idea of living off the grid in a place like New York City, underground, that's a premise I find to be very interesting. And I feel like you could really dive deep into that and just to kind of figure out like, okay, like how do they, what are the conditions that they live in? How do they survive from day to day? You always see like Donatello being the genius. Now, it's not hard to imagine that he might find some way for them to get access to, the internet or, basic electricity and technology. He's always been their tech guy. Obviously, the Turtles were originally created in a time before the internet, but nowadays, you could see a scenario where, Donnie would be able to get somehow to hack into some Wi-Fi and so that they could be connected to the internet. Obviously, they would have to become scavengers in order to survive, which you could do. There are a lot of junkyards in New York City and the area that they could probably get supplies from. But I always thought like maybe you could have Splinter and the Turtles maybe get some help while growing up as well. Like I mentioned earlier, like I could imagine Yoshi and Shen having very close ties with some of their relatives and or their neighbors in the particular neighborhood they live in. Um, and this has never been something that they really discussed in Ninja Turtles, as far as I know, but it would make sense to me that a master like Hamato Yoshi would be very highly respected in his community. So much so that some people might go out of their way to help him remain underground after his mutation, after his transformation. They might want to help him out, just to help him survive and raise the turtles. If they knew what his secret was. So it's not a hard thing to imagine that they might have some friends or relatives that might help keep Yoshi and the turtles stocked with food and other supplies that they would need to live. I mean, whether it's that or making money or however it is, you know, and rather than necessarily be in the sewer, like you don't want to have them be covered in raw sewage all the time. That'd be disgusting. Maybe you could find maybe they could find like an abandoned underground bomb shelter. Maybe something left over from World War II or the Cold War, or an abandoned subway station to live in, which we've seen that in the movies as well, rather than, random sewer pipes. Mm. Excuse me. Also, the turtles are always shown as being highly intelligent by the time, we catch up with them, by the time that they're teenagers. Now, you could have them obviously grow up with access to television, movies, the internet, that sort of thing, but maybe they also like sneak into libraries, like city libraries after hours. That was always something that I was curious about. Like, they're very intelligent and they're educated. they would have to have some sort of baseline education, either like splinters teaching them, or maybe someone, maybe one of those friends and relatives that I mentioned earlier, maybe would help them provide them with some sort of education as they grow up. That's something we haven't really seen, so that might be interesting to explore. Um, as far as some of the other characters, there's a great Casey Jones fan film here on YouTube, which I highly recommend, by the way. Look up Casey Jones, the movie. It's really great. It gives a great backstory for Casey as being a former hockey player turned, this blue collar vigilante who just wants to clean up his neighborhood from gangs like the Purple Dragons. Now, I mean, there's not a lot about that needs to be changed. I mean, as far as there's not a lot about Casey's character that really needs to be all that different. Like, he's a cool, relatable character. He's funny. Casey is a very compelling character. And as far as April O'Neil, now she's had several origins as well. In some versions of the story, she's a scientist or an intern to a scientist. Sometimes she's a news reporter who also owns an antique store for some reason, which I think was passed down to her. It was something that she got from her family. Maybe she could like start off as being like a freelance reporter or a blogger who also interns at TCRI, which could give her a connection to the Turtles. Although I mean, I liked what they did in the 1990 movie, where she was a reporter who was getting too close to the Foot Clan, and that's why they started attacking her. So that wasn't a bad choice either. And once you have all that set up, then you can add in characters like Baxter Stockman and Bebop and Rocksteady, and as the Foot Clan makes their presence felt in New York. I would personally avoid dealing with Krang or any of the other alien creatures, at least at first. I mean, if I was like pitching a movie series, I would kind of wait until like the second or third movie to start going in that route. I know, I think Peter Laird, Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird were the creators of the Turtles. I think Peter Laird leaned a little more heavily into some of the sci-fi and the monster stuff than Kevin Eastman did. So I mean, I tend to relate a little bit more to like the street level stuff, and that's where I would start the Turtles before going too deep into the sci-fi things. You could get there eventually. I'm not saying that you couldn't do it, but I feel like it makes more sense for them to start off fighting the Foot Clan or the Purple Dragons, or even organized crime. Like you talk about the Russian mob, La Cosa Nostra, Chinese triads, the Yakuza, Latin Kings, the Irish Mafia, like any number of things. You could base it on any number of real life organized crime groups in New York City. There's a lot you could do with that, and especially if it, again going back to their ties with, with Yoshi having ties to his neighborhood. Maybe if like their neighborhood is being threatened, Chinatown or Little Tokyo. I don't know if there's a Little Tokyo in New York, but it would be something like that where it's like that could give them incentive to want to protect innocent people, rather than them just going around picking fights with random criminals. You want to have some sort of motivation for them to do what they do. I mean, besides doing the right thing, of course, because that's what heroes do. You could do a lot of that stuff before getting to Krang and Dimension X or the other aliens like the Triceratons or any of that, which, I mean, like I said, you could eventually do. And especially you could, suggest that the ooze, which is usually, the mutagen, is usually of alien origin. So that could be their way into, the cosmic end of the Ninja Turtles lore, if you will. So that could be a way that they do it. It's funny, in Ninja Turtles 2, The Secret of the Ooze from 1991, they actually, I feel like they wanted to go like the alien route with it, but they actually said in the movie that the ooze was accidentally made in a lab. Just kind of a random accident of science. which is fine, but it's not exactly the most compelling story. And even as a kid, I felt a little bit let down. Like, what? Wait, that's the secret of the ooze? Not really a great secret. But I digress. Even though the turtles are always, obviously Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, you know, emphasis on teenage, they're always being depicted as teenagers. I think it would be cool to see them eventually grow up and to come of age, to grow up into adulthood and to evolve like that, and maybe even eventually have their own solo adventures at some point and then come back together. I feel like, Raph in particular would be the first to go out on his own and just kind of, establish his own thing. Like, he seems like he'd be the prodigal son of the four. You never know, but each of them could go off and maybe go have adventures outside of New York and then eventually come back. And I think at some point, if you're going to do a Ninja Turtles series, I think, like a movie series, I think eventually you would have to publicly reveal the turtles um, to the public. Like, they can't stay hidden forever. I think I feel like eventually you would have to get to that point, especially as as the battles they have become more epic, and especially as you bring in aliens and stuff like that. Like, eventually people would have to figure out that they exist. That could present a lot of interesting storytelling ideas as well. Um, I think in the recent IDW comics, I heard about this story arc called Mutant Town, where an entire section of New York, I think maybe either Staten Island or Brooklyn or something, becomes infected with the ooze, and several people turn into mutants. You could use that to introduce characters like the Mighty Mutanimals, for example. If you're a longtime Ninja Turtles fan, you know who they are, like Leatherhead and Mondo Gecko and Ace Duck and all these other characters that I think were just created for the toy line, and then were in the animated series as well. But you could use something like that to explore those characters down the road and make their universe even larger. So yeah, those were some basic ideas I had for what the plot could be. I could, if you want to, ask me about specifics, you could always leave a comment, and if you want me to elaborate on this stuff in a future live stream, you can. I did want to go over a few casting ideas that come to mind. Casting is a little tricky because you never know when these movies are going to get made, but I could at least show you kind of what I had in mind when I think of who could play these characters. I've always really liked Ken Watanabe. He was in The Last Samurai, and he was in Batman Begins. Really a great Japanese-American actor. He was also, I think, in Kong vs. Godzilla. I feel like he would be a great choice to play Hamato Yoshi, or Splinter. For April O'Neil, I always imagine someone like Anna Kendrick, or for Casey Jones, I think someone like John Bernthal. But again, for a movie like this, you might want to go younger. Again, who knows when a movie like this would even get made, or when they're making the next Ninja Turtles live action movie. But you might want to get someone in like their early to mid 20s maybe to start. But I don't know. Those are two actors that kind of come to mind when I think of April and Casey. I feel like they would be good choices. As far as the Turtles themselves, you could go with voice actors who sound younger. They don't necessarily have to be younger. But I always thought, like, why not use some more Asian American actors in these roles? Now, I say that not to be politically correct or anything like that, not to pander or anything, but I just and because again, this is also voiceover work, so it doesn't really matter what the ethnicity of the actors is. I don't know, for some reason I feel like it might make sense in this case. Their father, more or less, Master Splinter, Hamato Yoshi, is from Japan. So it kind of, I feel like that would be kind of a cool Easter egg. And like Leonardo in the original live action movies was played by Brian Tachi or Tochi. I don't know how you pronounce it, but he was great. He was also he was in Revenge of the Nerds and the Police Academy movies. I forget the name of the character he played. Yeah, I was trying to remember the name of his character in Revenge of the Nerds, but he's great. Takashi, that was it. He was he was Takashi in Revenge of the Nerds. He was awesome, but he was Leonardo in the old movies. But like for these, like for Leo, I imagine someone like Sung Kang or Sung Kang, the guy who plays Han from the Fast and Furious movies. I think he's great. Like, he's got that cool demeanor, but like he also has a little bit of a commanding presence about him. Like he could be a good Leo. For Donatello, I always imagine either like John Cho, from Harold and Kumar, in the Star Trek movies. He played Sulu. Like John Cho is a great actor, or even like Randall Park, who's he's hilarious. But I couldn't imagine Randall as Mikey necessarily, but like I can imagine Randall Park as Donnie. That would be pretty cool. Or for Raph, Raph is a little trickier because like you want someone who has that sort of New York, Brooklyn swagger and attitude about him. Um, One of the things I loved most about the 2014 and 26 and the 2016 Ninja Turtle movies was Alan Ritchson. How they cast him to be Raph. He was he was perfect for him. He nailed the voice, mannerisms. He was fantastic. And Josh Pice from from the first Ninja Turtles movie, and some of the other voice actors they had for some of the other ones. He was great as well. Um, I'm trying to think about who could do Raph now. I really like the actor who plays Kyler in Cobra Kai. He's like kind of the bully, but like he's if you watch Cobra Kai, you know what character I'm talking about. I think the actor's name is Joe Seo. I believe he's Korean American, but yeah. And with Mikey, you would want someone who's funny, like who's lighthearted, happy-go-lucky. You know, One of the names that come to mind for me, and I'm a big pro wrestling fan, so I think a lot about pro wrestler like Matt Cardona. If you're a wrestling fan, you know who he is. If he was known as Zack Ryder in WWE. Um, he's a guy from Long Island. He played like the Long Island bro, kind of character a lot. But he was very goofy and lighthearted, and is a diehard Ninja Turtles fan. So he would jump at the chance if he ever got offered that role. The only thing about Matt is I think his voice is a little too deep. Like he has a very low voice. Like maybe if you pitched him up a little bit to be Mikey, I mean that could work. I don't know how much he doesn't really have a lot of acting experience. Although Matt Cardona has recently been on like the Broadway, the last fight or the last match I think is this new like off Broadway musical that he's been a part of. So he's got some acting chops. I feel like he could pull it off. Um, either way, I don't think that Mikey should necessarily sound like a California surfer either, which I know that's crazy to think because he's always been sort of depicted that way. And no disrespect to Townsend Coleman or Greg Sipes, who both of those guys did incredible jobs playing Mikey, and Robbie Rist as well. But like, I think you could keep that personality, but to me, it never really made sense why Mikey, who grew up in New York, why he would necessarily sound like Jeff Spicoli from Fast Times at Ridgemont High. So I don't know. That was just always something I kind of thought about. Like you could have someone with sort of that Long Island vibe or a New York vibe, but who's a little more lighter and happy-go-lucky, which is Mikey. So I feel like you could do that. Also, in terms of casting, like fan casting, if I was to look for someone to play Baxter Stockman, I would think Giancarlo Esposito, who's Gus Fring from Breaking Bad, and he's also been in The Mandalorian. Just that guy could play any role. Yeah, I mean he's incredible. Um, finally, one last thing I would want to talk about. Um, we have to talk about the turtles as weapons. Now, Donnie and Mikey, they've always had sort of the non-lethal weapons, like the bow staff and the nunchucks, or the, the nunchakus. Is it how it's pronounced? I'm not sure. Um, it depends on who you ask, I guess. But Leo and Raph have always had the swords and the size. And you could do a lot of damage with that. Now, I realized that the original Mirage comics were very violent, and the Turtles, they had no problems killing their enemies in those original black and white comics. The only thing is, if we wanted to keep this movie PG-13, we'd have to find some ways around that. Now, look, I'm sure there are many of you out there who would love to see Leo and Raph just hacking foot ninjas to pieces. And, personally, that's not really my thing. I don't necessarily need to see that. I'm sure I'm probably in the minority here. I mean, it depends on how far you'd want to go with this. Um, I don't know. Just to me personally, I don't really think you need to have a ton of blood and guts in a Ninja Turtles movie. That's just me. Um, it's tough though because those weapons sort of define the turtles, and you can't not have them in there. But maybe if each turtle had their own sets of like lethal weapons and non-lethal weapons, depending on what sort of situation they were in. I'm not even saying that they should never kill their opponents necessarily. I don't know. I think it depends on the situation. Like, I mean, I don't think you need to be chopping the heads off of someone who's just stealing a purse or something like that. That's a little extreme. Um, I mean, when you're fighting like a giant group of ninjas who are also armed to the teeth, maybe that's what you have to do in order to survive. I don't know. I don't know, but like, I think there's a way of doing that without it being super gory or blood and guts or looking like a Deadpool movie or something, or like Ninja Assassin. Like that movie was super gory. Like we don't really need it to be a slasher film, but or at least, but I think the idea of them having both lethal and non-lethal weapons, and I'm talking all four of them, I think that makes sense if nothing else for consistency. Like why would Donnie and Mikey have weapons that are non-lethal, but Raph and Leo have lethal weapons? It doesn't make any sense. Either they're all operating under the same rules, or none of them are. Like that. That's just, I don't know. That's one little thing I noticed about it. But yeah, that was sort of those were sort of my thoughts about how I would reboot the Ninja Turtles if I was in charge with it. Now, I know you guys probably have a lot of questions, and there are a lot of specifics that I could elaborate on if you wanted me to. I feel like I've been talking for a while, so I appreciate you guys sticking with me this long. All of my links are below in the description. Make sure you like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Keep those requests coming. If you want me to do a follow-up on this, I can maybe do like a live stream where I answer some questions that some of you guys might have, and maybe elaborate a little bit more on what I would do with the Ninja Turtles. If you have any requests for some other movies or series or intellectual properties that you'd want me to reboot or adapt, let me know, because I've got a few different ideas in my head that I plan on getting out there pretty soon. But this is something I've wanted to do for a while, and I figured that the Turtles would be a good first topic for one of these fireside pitches. So thank you guys for tuning in. This has been the Phoenix Report. I'm Jack Connor, and I'll see you later. Cowabunga.